Thank you so much, Dr. Wong, for your presentation. Your presentation was insightful and incisive and left me with a wide range of thoughts and feelings and musings, for which some are directly connected to what you've said and some are indirectly related. I'd like to focus just for a few moments on the questions and musings that were raised for me as I read through your paper and as I've listened to you presented here today. But before doing so, I'd like to provide a bit of context for my perspectives of who I am and what shaped my thoughts. As an African-American woman of enslaved descent, who as a girl was raised at the rare intersection of the evangelical church and the Black church, of the 1980s and the 1990s, your paper speaks to my lived experience as a person and to my professional and scholarly pursuits as a psychologist who integrates both theology and psychology in my work. As I think about what has shaped me, I want to reflect back on a few moments of the past. As a teenager, I recall the emergence of Joshua Harris's book that is now infamous, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, which perhaps some of you are familiar with, hearkening back to this idea of purity and purity culture that you alluded to at the beginning of your paper. I'm mindful, though, that even before I became entranced and entrapped by some of the trappings of purity culture, I was aware of some of the realities of patriarchal thought, though I didn't have that language at the time. Even before encountering Harris's book, I was the daughter of two strong Christian parents and had my own deep understandings of the text of Scripture and tried to make sense of these ideas in light of my surroundings. I remember even as early as middle school, sitting and grappling with a series of texts. One for which I think my 11-year-old mind perhaps was too overwhelmed to fully understand. Here's an example of what I mean. I keenly remember the day that I read Leviticus chapter 27, verses 1 through 4. Perhaps many of you are readily aware of what Leviticus 27 is, but perhaps not. And for everyone's sake, I'll provide some context. Leviticus chapter 27 is talking quite a bit about holiness and what it means for us to be devoted to God in order to present ourselves pure before God. In this case, not us as the church, but the Hebrew people of the time. I'm mindful of the fact that while I didn't understand much of the historical or cultural context that you alluded to that shaped the biblical readings of the text for us as the church now, my little mind as an 11-year-old was trying to grapple with how to make sense of these ideas of what it means to be a woman and what God thinks about what it means to be a woman, or a girl in my case, to be female. So here I am at 11 encountering this text, Leviticus chapter 27, verses 1 through 4. It reads, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Speak to the Israelites and say to them, if anyone makes a special vow to dedicate a person to the Lord by giving the equivalent value, set the value of a male between the ages of 20 and 60 at 50 shekels, according to the sanctuary shekel. And for a female, set her value at 30 shekels.'" Set her value at 30 shekels. My 11-year-old mind sat looking at the face valid portion of the text, asking, does that mean that women are less valuable than men? Though I knew something about the fact that, yes, women might be able to contribute less manual labor, perhaps, or women might not be as valuable for other types of particular economic desires or gains, it didn't make any sense to me that the Lord would say to Moses, set her value at 30 shekels and set his value at 50 shekels. How was I to wrestle with this conception of value? How was I to wrestle with this idea, especially when I was raised in a home that said men and women are equally valuable before God? How could these things both be true? What's more, what was I to do with the fact that the way that such a simple reading of the text was actually reinforced by the hierarchy that I saw in my Christian communities, where men were able to step into positions to prove their desire to follow God, to be faithful to God, to be holy, to be pure in ways that look distinct from and higher than the women who were around, at least in my circles. These inherently psychological questions about my value and my worth within the community of faith were grounded in a view of the text. I didn't actually at the time as an 11-year-old have the benefit of going to college and studying the biblical text or going to graduate school here at Fuller and trying to break down some of the historical context to give form that might be more meaningful and holistic. While I didn't understand these things, it is clear to me that this patriarchal way of understanding the world and of understanding myself was being internalized. I didn't know what to do with that. I want to be clear, though. I was never told that women are inferior to men. That was never an explicit message that was given to me. But as I read the text and I tried to interpret what it said, I was left with this seeming obvious result. Women are less valuable than men. I see that in the ecclesial spaces I'm in. I see that in the theological and biblical hermeneutical frameworks that I use. So even when I'm simply reading the text myself, the patriarchy is there in painful and real ways. It was felt. I saw it. Patriarchy is like that. It is pervasive. It is pernicious. It is insidious. With the few moments that I have left today, I'd like to explore how in the world some type of patriarchal view might come into being from a psychological perspective. I'd like to propose perhaps that your title, Dangerous Women and the Promise of Patriarchy, belies a provocative perception that is itself patriarchal, that women are dangerous, is itself perhaps a patriarchal claim. The perception of women as inherently dangerous, the audacious idea that we pose a threat with our bodies or with our spirits or souls to men is a strange inversion of power as we see it in society. How might this inversion, this belief that women are the dangerous ones, have developed? Clearly, we have heard a wonderful explication of how philosophically and historically and biblically and theologically some of these ideas have come to play. And I want to ask what also might be going on psychologically as well. Sigmund Freud, considered the father of Western psychology, who popularized the talking cure that we now simply know as therapy, was not only a psychoanalyst and a medical doctor, but also a theorist. For all of his sexist ideas, which I will always acknowledge, he's an incredibly sexist man. For all of his sexist ideas, I do think there are some redemptive aspects of his theory that are worth considering as we think about patriarchy and sexism and how it has come to be. Sigmund Freud spent quite a bit of time thinking about anxiety and how we grapple with things that make us anxious. And he coined this idea of defense mechanisms. Just by a show of hands, if you've heard of the idea of defenses, would you just raise your hand? Yes. Freud has popularized this idea that we experience things that feel threatening to us and we have to find a way to cope. And he believes that we have a series of ways to cope. Some of those ways have become very normal to us, like denial, for instance. That's one way of coping. But some ways of coping have not been as popular to the rest of the lay world. But here's one I want to propose. Freud proposes the idea that a process called reaction formation can take place. Reaction formation is a strange thing, but reaction formation is when we experience something in others, or perhaps even more powerfully within ourselves, that seems overwhelmingly frightening to us, and we find a way to distance ourselves from it. Reaction formation is a way of defending ourselves from a belief about ourselves that seems unacceptable in our social or religious context. In this way, reaction formation is a defense that takes the truth and inverts it. For example, if I find that I am prejudiced against a group of people, but I believe it is actually morally reprehensible to hold prejudice in my heart, then to default to the defense of reaction formation, I would find myself in a place of trying to convince myself of the opposite of this truth. The truth is I am prejudiced, and that is the case for all humans. We have prejudices, and the question is what we're doing about them. But the truth is, as a prejudiced person, if I don't want to hold that truth, I distance myself. I could simply deny and say, oh, I'm not prejudiced, but reaction formation goes a step further. It says, not only am I not prejudiced, I actually love the group of people that I'm prejudiced against. I'm actually the epitome of inclusion for that group of people. I am not prejudiced. I'm the exact opposite. What is crazy is that you actually begin to believe that inversion of the truth. Despite the facts, despite the evidence, you begin to believe this thing. Freud theorizes that we lean towards reaction formation because the reality that we are prejudiced, or that for men, and perhaps the reality that you in fact do have more power and have had more power, is an overwhelming fact. And facts can be overwhelming. We know this about race. We know this about gender. We know this about sexuality. We know this about Christianity in the Western world. Power and privilege can be overwhelming to acknowledge. So we find ways to defend ourselves from it. So what then do we do? How do we come to grips with this reality? I would like to propose very simply that there are many, many things we could do, but for the sake of time, I will say this. Perhaps as men have become aware of their great power and the misuse of the same, perhaps they or you have become overwhelmed by this reality, overwhelmed by the historical weight, not only of your own self, but of the group that you are in fact connected to. I wonder if as an antidote to this overwhelming truth, we do not default to reaction formation, distancing ourselves from something that is in fact true. And I wonder if perhaps we could begin to come into contact with reality slowly and steadily in community. Perhaps as men begin to, in community, with women, with others, relinquish what was never meant to be theirs in its entirety. Power and agency that was never gifted to men specifically, but to human beings on behalf of the Creator for the sake of the created order and the coming of the kingdom and shalom. Perhaps as you relinquish what was never meant to be yours, the burden, the oppression, not only of you, but of me and of others, will begin to subside. Perhaps, as I claim the antidote to the lie, many lies connected to patriarchy and its implications psychologically and relationally and theologically, is to tell the truth and to allow the truth to set us free. Thank you.